They gave the girl a dead house and a dry well. Then they called it her inheritance. Her aunt smiled when she said it. Her uncle did not so much as look up from counting what used to be theirs. 16 years old, both her parents a week in the ground, and this was her share. A roof full of holes, a yard full of weeds, and an old well that had held no water since before she was born. "You won't draw a thing out of that well but dust," her uncle said. And he laughed. She let him, because there was something he failed to notice, something none of them noticed. The night before her mother died, she was stitching. Slow, careful. A worn old quilt nobody wanted, her hands trembling over every thread, and she was smiling. The girl had thought it strange then, a dying woman, smiling over a blanket. She understood it now. They took the silver. They took the deeds. They took every shining thing they could carry, and they sneered at the girl left with rags and a hole in the ground. But her mother had not left her rags. Her mother had left her a map, and she had stitched it where a daughter would think to look. The lawyer's office smelled of old paper and pipe smoke and something sour underneath, the way a room smells when bad news has been sitting in it too long. The girl sat very still, 16 years old, a borrowed black dress, stiff at the collar, 2 sizes too large in the shoulders. Her hands were folded in her lap because she did not trust them to stay still any other way. Her name was Eliza. A week ago, she had a mother who hummed while she worked the dough, a father who could fix near anything with his 2 hands and a length of wire. A week ago, she had a home that smelled of bread and wood smoke and her mother's lavender water. Now she had this, a hard chair, a cold room, and 2 people across the table who could not quite hide how much they wanted her gone. Her Uncle Silas sat with his hat balanced on one knee, drumming his fingers against the brim. Tap, tap, tap. He had the kind of face that smiled with the mouth while the eyes stayed busy counting. Beside him, her Aunt Cora dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a folded handkerchief. The handkerchief stayed perfectly dry. It was a performance, and they were the audience for it, and the lawyer, and the girl. But Cora played it anyway. She had dressed for grief. Black silk, a little too fine. A brooch at her throat that caught the light when she breathed. She had come to bury sorrow and walk out with a fortune, and she had decided she would do it looking the part. There was someone else in the room, too. A man near the back, by the window. Gray coat, quiet hands resting on the head of a cane he did not seem to need. He had not been introduced. He had not spoken a single word. And somehow, that made him louder than anyone there. He simply watched, the way a hawk watches a field of long grass. Patient, unblinking, waiting for the small thing to move. Eliza noticed him. She did not know yet why he mattered. She would learn. The lawyer cleared his throat, a sound like a key turning in a stiff lock, and he unrolled the papers across the desk. The tapping of Silas's fingers stopped. This was the moment they had all been circling for days. A whole week of low voices behind closed doors. A week of hands closing around things that did not belong to them yet. There was the store in town, with its full shelves and its good name above the door. There were the freight contracts, the wagons that ran the long road east and came back heavy with coin and promise. And there was the claim out past the ridge, the land everyone in town whispered about. The land that was supposed to make somebody rich enough to leave the dust behind for good. That was the inheritance worth fighting over. That was the prize. The lawyer read in a flat, careful voice, the voice of a man who had learned a long time ago to keep his face still while families came apart in front of him. To my brother Silas, he read, and his wife Cora, the business holdings in their entirety, the store, the freight contracts, the claim, and the land that surrounds it. Cora made a small sound. Grief. She meant it to be. It came out closer to a purr. Silas leaned back in his chair and let his breath out slow. The smile reached his eyes at last. He had the whole bright world in his two hands, and he had not even had to ask for it twice. Then the lawyer turned the page. "And to my daughter," he read, and the room seemed to lean in to listen. "Eliza." She lifted her head. For one breath, one single, foolish breath, she let herself hope. It is a dangerous thing, hope, in a room full of people who have already decided your worth. The home place, the lawyer read. The house, the land it stands upon, and the well. Silence. A long, ringing silence. Then Cora laughed. She tried to swallow it, and that only made it worse, because it came out broken and high. A laugh dressed up as a cough, and fooling no one. "The old place," she said, half wondering, as if she could not quite believe her luck. "The dead house. Why, the roof caved in years ago. There's nothing out there but rot and weeds and rattlesnakes in the cellar." Silas did not even try to hide his. His laugh was lower, worse, the laugh of a man who has just learned that the world arranges itself exactly the way he suspected it did. The strong take, the clever take more, and the weak are left to sweep up the dust. "A fine gift," he said, and turned that smiling mouth toward the girl. "A ruin, for the girl with her head in the clouds." He let the cruelty find its mark before he finished. "You can mend the roof with daydreams, can't you, child? You were so good at those." The words landed somewhere soft and undefended. She kept her chin level. She would not give them the tears. She had decided that in the doorway, before she ever sat down, and she held to it now with everything she had left. But the words found her all the same. And across the room, the man in the gray coat did not laugh. He did not smile. He only tilted his head a fraction and looked at Eliza the way a man looks at a column of figures he has not finished adding. She would remember that look later. She did not understand it yet. The ride out to the home place was long, and the road was poor. Silas drove. He had insisted on it, framed it as a kindness the way he framed every small cruelty. But it felt less like kindness and more like a landlord riding out to inspect a worthless piece of property he already regretted being saddled with. The wheels groaned over the deep ruts. The sun pressed down white and merciless from a sky scrubbed bare of clouds. Heat shimmered up off the grass in long trembling waves, so the whole wide prairie seemed to ripple like a thing glimpsed through moving water. Eliza kept her eyes on the horizon. A small dark shape sat out there in the far distance, growing slowly larger with every turn of the wheel. She knew that shape. She had known it before she knew her own name. The angle of the roof against the sky, the lean of the chimney. Home. Once. Silas spoke twice on that long ride. The first time, he swept his whip out toward the empty miles. "Look at it," he said. "Nothing." Grass and dirt and the bones of dead things. Your father was a fool to ever build out here. A bigger fool to hang on as long as he did." She said nothing. The grass hissed past the wheels. The second time he spoke, the house had grown close enough to see clearly. And it was worse than she had let herself remember. The wild grass had crept right up to the walls and grown waist-high against them, whispering in the wind. The porch sagged hard to one side, like a man standing on a broken hip. Half the shingles were gone from the roof, and the holes gaped black against the bright sky. A single shutter hung from one hinge at an upstairs window, knocking against the boards. Knock, knock. A slow, mournful, lonely sound. It did not look like a house anymore. It looked like the skeleton of one, picked clean and left out in the weather. Silas drew the horses up. He did not climb down. "Well," he said, "here you are." Eliza gathered her small bag against her chest and slid down from the seat. Her boots touched the dry, packed earth of the yard, and the finality of it struck her then, full and cold and complete. This was the whole of it. This was her life now. A girl alone, a dying house, the edge of the known world, and past it, the long, indifferent grass. Off to the side of the yard stood the old well, a low ring of gray fieldstone, a rotted bucket, a length of frayed rope gone stiff and gray with age. It looked as dead as the rest of it. Deader. Silas followed the girl's gaze to it, and something pleased and ugly flickered behind his eyes. "Don't go hunting water in there," he said. "That well's been dry longer than you've drawn breath." He chuckled low to himself. "You won't draw a single thing out of that hole but dust, girl. Mark me." He let the words sit a moment and savored them, the way a man savors the last bite of a meal he did not pay for. Then he gathered the reins. "Try not to starve," he said, and he turned the wagon in a wide, lazy arc, and the wheels carried him back toward the town, back toward the store, and the wagons, and the bright land past the ridge, back toward everything that had been hers a week ago. Eliza stood in the yard until the dust had settled, until the rattle of the wheels had faded into the wide breathing hush of the grass, until it was just her, and the broken house, and the long, listening silence of the open country. She did not cry. She wanted to. There was a knot of it high in her throat, hot and aching. But she swallowed it down, because tears would not patch the roof, and they would not fill the empty pantry, and they would not bring back the two people sleeping now beneath the cold ground in town. So she picked up her bag, and she walked toward the house. The front door fought her. It groaned on rusted hinges, swollen tight in its warped frame, and she had to set her shoulder to it and lean her whole small weight before it gave with a shudder. Inside, the air was still and thick and old. It had the smell of a place shut up too long. Dust and dry wood, and the faint, cold ghost of a fire gone out a long season ago. It was the smell of absence, the smell of a house holding its breath, waiting for people who had stopped coming. Light fell in long, pale ribbons through the holes in the roof. Dust drifted slow through those ribbons, golden and turning, like something half alive that had been disturbed from a long sleep. She stepped in. Her footsteps echoed. The front room stood almost bare. A few hunched shapes sat under sheets gone gray with grime. A great stone hearth filled the far wall, its mantel swept empty, its black mouth full of cold ash, and the small bones of long-dead fires. In the kitchen, a hand pump leaned over a dry stone basin, rusted at the joints. The pantry door hung open on its empty shelves. A single tin plate sat on the counter, exactly where someone had set it down, a long time ago, and meant to come back for, and had not. She walked the lower rooms in a kind of daze, and with every step, the truth pressed harder against her ribs. It was not merely neglected. It was abandoned, a place where warmth and laughter and life had been, and then, simply, were not. The stairs creaked under her. Upstairs was no kinder. Wind whistled thin and high through a cracked pane, a sound like someone humming a tune far off and getting the notes wrong. And there, in the middle of what had once been her parents' room, sat a small iron-bound box. Her breath caught. For one wild instant, the hope came flooding back. Had they left her something after all? A few coins? A keepsake? Some small soft mercy, tucked away where the grasping hands would not think to reach? She dropped to her knees beside it. Her fingers found the cold, dark metal. But the lid already stood cracked open. The lock was broken, the latch bent and scarred, where someone had set a bar to it and forced it wide. She lifted the heavy lid anyway. Empty. Of course it was empty. They had been here, Silas and Cora. They had come straight from the lawyer, like as not, the ink barely dry on the will. And they had torn the place apart, looking for any small thing they might have missed. They had picked her parents' last secrets clean and left her the husk. Eliza sat back on her heels. The emptiness of that box looked exactly the way the inside of her felt. And for a moment, one heavy, sinking, sliding moment, she let her uncle's voice creep into her head, a ruin for the girl with her head in the clouds. Mend the roof with your daydreams. Maybe he had the right of it. Maybe this was all there had been, all along. Maybe she had been a fool to hope for anything more. The light shifted across the bare floor. The shutter knocked downstairs and far away. Knock, knock. And the house held its breath and waited and said nothing at all. She spent that long afternoon doing small things. There is a quiet mercy in small things, when the large things have grown too heavy to lift. She swept a corner of the kitchen with a worn broom until the floorboards showed through gray. She dragged a sheet off a wooden chair and carried it to the doorway and beat the dust from it, coughing, her eyes stinging, watching the pale cloud rise and scatter on the warm wind. She found a tin cup, half a candle, a flint, a wooden chair her father used to sit in of an evening, worn smooth where his hands had rested. She did not let herself sit in it. Not yet. She filled the cup at a trickle of a stream she remembered from her girlhood, down past the dead garden, and drank, and felt a little stronger for it. She gathered a few dry sticks and laid them ready in the hearth, though she did not light them. There was something in her that did not want to wake that cold black mouth just yet. As the day wore down, the light through the broken roof turned from white to gold to a deep and bleeding orange. The heat let go of the land. Somewhere out in the tall grass, a single bird called once, and then thought better of it, and went quiet. Eliza carried her thin bedroll to the swept corner of the kitchen. And then she went and sat on the sagging porch steps to watch the dark roll in. It came fast, out here. No lamps in the distant windows, no neighbors stirring, no church bell, no rattle of a passing cart, no ordinary friendly sounds of people living their lives nearby. The sky simply filled up, slow and silent, with stars, more than a person could count, hard and bright and cold, and very, very far away. And the loneliness settled over her shoulders like a second coat, heavier than the first. She thought she might weep then. She had earned it. A girl could be forgiven for weeping, alone in the dark, at the edge of the world, with everything she had ever loved taken from her. But the tears would not come. What came instead was the cold. It rose up out of the ground as the day's heat fled the land. It came creeping through her thin black dress and found its way down into her bones. She wrapped her arms tight around her drawn-up knees and shivered, and she understood that she could not pass the night like this. She needed warmth. And then she remembered. In the very bottom of her small bag, folded and refolded a dozen careful times, was the single thing she had carried out of her old life, the one thing Silas and Cora had glanced at and curled their lips at and left behind without a second thought. An old quilt. Her mother's quilt. It was a worn and humble thing. The colors had faded with years of washing to soft grays and washed-out gentle blues. The batting had gone thin in places, thin enough that a body could almost see candlelight through it if she held it up to the flame. The edges were frayed soft. One corner had been mended so many times across the years that it had become more thread than cloth. Cora had wrinkled her nose at it that last day in the old house. "Leave the rag," she had said, waving a gloved hand. "It isn't fit to wrap a dog in. It isn't worth the carrying." But Eliza had carried it, because her mother had made it, because her mother's two hands had touched every inch of it across the years, because in the last hard days, when her mother had grown too weak to do much of anything at all, she had asked for that quilt, and her needle, and a bit of dark thread. Eliza remembered watching her, a woman with her time running short, propped up against the pillows, stitching slow and patient at an old worn blanket nobody else wanted. Her hands had trembled, her breath had come thin and short, and still she bent to the work, hour upon quiet hour, in the lamplight. And she had been smiling. Eliza had thought it strange then, a little sad even, a woman with so few days left to her, spending them on a rag. She lit the half-candle now, there in the dark and silent kitchen. She unfolded the quilt across her lap, and she drew it up around her thin shoulders, and for the first time since the wagons and the lawyers and the dry-eyed weeping and the laughter that still rang in her ears, she felt something close to comfort, her mother's warmth, sewn into cloth, reaching across the dark to find her. She pulled it tighter around herself, and that was when she felt it. A ridge. Beneath her fingers, along one of the inner seams, there ran a hard and uneven line. A thickness that did not belong there. A small secret bulk hidden under the worn cloth. She frowned. She had slept beneath this quilt 100 nights and more. She knew its softness and its thin spots, and the frayed corner that had been mended past counting. She did not remember this. She turned the quilt toward the candle and ran her thumb slow along the seam. There, a length of stitching, fresh against the old, the thread a shade darker than the rest. the work careful and deliberate, and tucked away just exactly where the folds of the cloth would hide it from a careless eye. New stitching on an old quilt, done by hands that had known they were running out of days. And Eliza's heart began to beat a strange new rhythm against her ribs. This was not a thing Silas would have looked for. It was too small, too poor, too plain. A man hunting after silver and deeds does not pause to search the hem of a beggar's blanket. He had held wealth in his mind, and so he had walked right past it, the way the proud so often do. But a daughter might search there. A daughter who had been taught, on long, quiet winter evenings by the fire, how to read the silent language of a needle and thread. Eliza set the candle close. She found the small, dull knife she had used to scrape the floor. Her hands were not quite steady, and she pressed them flat against her knee a moment to still them. She drew one slow breath in. She let it slow back out. And then, gently, so gently, the way her mother had taught her, taking care not to tear, refusing to rush, she began to pick at the fresh, dark thread. One stitch, then another. The seam loosened. The worn cloth parted along the hidden line, and inside, between the soft, faded front of the quilt and its thin gray backing, tucked deep into the warmth, into the very place where a sleeping girl's heart would lie against it through the cold nights, was a second piece of cloth. A small square, folded tight and small, hidden away where the cold and the dark and a daughter's patient searching hands would find it, and where the grasping and the greedy would feel nothing at all but an old, soft rag. Eliza's breath stopped in her throat. She drew it out, carefully, as if it might come apart in her fingers. She unfolded it there in the trembling candlelight, smoothing it flat against her knee, and she leaned in close to see it true. It was not a letter. It was not money. It was stitching, lines and small careful marks, and a scattering of knotted points, all worked in dark thread across the pale square of cloth. A row of shapes that meant nothing on their face, and yet had so plainly been made to mean a great deal. There were no flowers in this pattern, no birds along the border, no pretty thing at all, only symbols, a pattern with a purpose buried in it, a code stitched in secret and hidden away inside the single thing they had been far too proud to want. And Eliza understood, all at once, the truth of it rushing through her like the first warm wind of spring breaking the back of a long, hard winter. Her mother had not been sewing a rag. Her mother had been sewing a map, smiling in those last quiet days, smiling because she knew, smiling because she had found a way to reach out across the dark, past the reach of grasping hands, and place something into her daughter's keeping that the greedy would walk straight past without a second glance. They had taken the store. They had taken the wagons. They had taken the claim, and the land, and the box, and the deeds, and every bright and shining thing they could carry off in their arms, and they had left behind the single thing that truly mattered. Eliza sat very still, the cloth pressed to her chest, the candle burning low, the broken house creaking and settling in the wind all around her, like an old thing breathing in its sleep. She was alone. That much was so, but she was not abandoned. Her parents had trusted her. They had believed her clever enough, and patient enough, and watchful enough, to look past the ruin and see the worth that was hidden down inside it. They had not left her with nothing. They had left her with everything. They had simply wrapped it where one set of hands would think to look. A slow heat rose in her chest, and it was not the quilt that made it. It was something stronger than grief, something with a backbone in it. She looked down at the strange stitched symbols, glowing faint and gold in the candlelight, and a single clear and certain thought rose up through the fear and the cold and the loneliness and stood there steady. This was the true inheritance, not the house, not the land, not even what the strange marks might lead her toward. The trust her mother had stitched into the cloth, and she meant to be worthy of it. Outside, far off across the dark and rustling grass, a coyote called once to the wide and empty miles. The candle flame bent low, then steadied. And in the swept corner of a house the whole world had given up for dead, a 16-year-old girl bent over a small square of cloth and began, very quietly, very patiently, to read her mother's last gift to her. One stitch at a time. She did not sleep that night. There was work to be done now, and for the first time in a long, dark week, a reason to do it. The map lay open in her lap, and somewhere out in that ruined, sneered-at, given-up place, something her mother wanted her to find was waiting. She just had to learn how to read the way home. Morning came slow and gray to the broken house. The candle had burned itself down to a puddle of soft wax in the tin, and still the girl sat in the swept corner where the night had left her. The small square of cloth spread flat across her knees. She had not slept. She had studied. By the thin first light that crept in through the holes in the roof, Eliza bent close over her mother's stitching and tried, with a patience born of need, to make the strange marks give up their meaning. It was hard going. The symbols were small. A row of knots here. A line of slanted stitches there. A shape that looped and turned back toward itself. A scatter of points like seeds thrown across a furrow. They meant something. She was certain of that, down in her bones. But certainty is one thing, and understanding is another, and the second is far harder won. Her stomach ached with a hollow that had gone past hunger into something quieter. There had been a heel of bread in her bag. It was gone now. The pantry shelves stood bare, the way they had stood bare since she walked through the door. A girl cannot live on a riddle. A girl cannot read a map with her hands shaking from want. So Eliza folded the small square of cloth, slow and careful, along the lines her mother had pressed into it. She tucked it deep into the bodice of her dress against her heart, where it would stay warm and close and hidden. And she stood and steadied herself against the wall and looked toward the long road that ran back to town. She would have to go. There was nothing for it. A girl with no bread must go where the bread is. Even when the bread is in a town full of people who watched her family, laughed at, and said nothing. The walk to town was long, and the sun climbed as she went. By the time the first low buildings rose up out of the shimmer of heat, her feet ached and her throat had gone dry as the well in her yard. The town was a small one, a single dusty street, a church with a leaning steeple, a blacksmith's ringing, a few storefronts with their wares set out in the windows, and people moving along the boardwalks who slowed, just a little, when they saw the thin girl in the ill-fitting black dress come walking in from the prairie alone. She felt their eyes. She kept her chin level, the way she had learned to, and she did not let them see How the looking made her feel small. There was a store at the heart of the street, the kind of place that sold a little of everything. Flour and nails and cloth and lamp oil, peppermint sticks in a jar on the counter, sacks of meal stacked against the wall. Eliza stopped outside it. She had no money. She had a square of stitched cloth she could not read, a ruin of a house, and a name in this town that had been used as the punchline to a joke read aloud in a lawyer's office. But she had to eat, so she squared her thin shoulders and she pushed open the door, and a small bell rang above her head. The woman behind the counter was past middle years, broad and soft-faced, with gray threaded through dark hair pinned up loose. A widow, by her plain dark dress and the quiet, settled way she held herself. She had the look of someone who had carried sorrow of her own and come out the far side of it with her kindness intact. Her name was Della. She looked up when the bell rang, and when she saw who had come in, the orphaned girl, the one the whole town had been clucking over, the one tossed out to the dead house at the edge of the world, something moved across her face. It was not pity. Pity, Eliza had learned to recognize and to dread. Pity had a sour edge to it, a looking down. This was something gentler. This was the look of one person seeing another person and choosing to see her whole. "Well," said Della, setting down the cloth she'd been folding. "There you are." Eliza did not know what to say to that. She had come prepared to ask, and to be refused, and to bear the refusal with what dignity she could scrape together. She had not come prepared for "there you are," as if she had been expected, as if she had been, in some small way, awaited. "I haven't any money," the girl said. It came out plainer and harder than she meant it. She had decided to get the worst of it said first, before the woman could decide for her. Della came around the end of the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "I didn't ask you for any," she said, and she began, without another word, to gather things. A small sack of meal, a twist of coffee, a few eggs, settled careful into a bit of straw, a round of cheese wrapped in cloth, a jar of preserves, dark and sweet-looking, that she took down from a high shelf without being asked. Eliza watched, her throat tight. "I can't pay for any of that," she said again. "You can pay when you can pay," said Della, and she did not look up from her gathering. "And if the day comes, you can't. Then you'll have eaten, and that's worth more to me than the coin would have been." She paused then. She looked at the girl. Really looked. "I knew your mother," Della said, quiet. "A long while back, before you were big enough to remember me." Her hands went still on the counter. "She had a way of seeing what mattered, your mother. When the rest of the town saw a thing one way, she'd tilt her head and see it another, and turn out to be right more often than not." A small, sad smile. "You've got her eyes." Eliza's vision blurred. She blinked it back, hard. It had been a long week of cold looks and colder words, of laughter at her expense and hands closing around what was hers. And now, here, over a counter in a dusty store, a stranger who was not quite a stranger had spoken of her mother with love. It undid something in her. Not all the way, but a little. The first thread of a knot that had been pulled too tight, easing, just so. "Thank you," Eliza managed. It was a small thing to say. It was the whole of her heart. Della only nodded and went on packing the basket, the way a person does when they understand that some kindnesses are spoiled by too much talk. It was while the girl stood there, holding her basket, blinking back what she would not let fall, that she felt it. A weight. The particular weight of being watched. She turned her head. Through the front window of the store, across the dusty street, a man stood in the shade of an awning. Gray coat. Quiet hands. The man from the lawyer's office. He was not doing anything. He was leaning against a post, his hat tipped low, for all the world like a man with no business and nowhere in particular to be. But his face was turned toward the store, toward her, and though she could not see his eyes beneath the brim of his hat, she felt the weight of them all the same, that same slow, adding up attention, as if she were a figure in a long sum he was working out, and had grown more interesting to him than she had been before. A small chill walked up the back of her neck, despite the heat of the day. "Who is that?" she asked, low. Della followed her gaze out the window. Her own face went careful. "Don't rightly know," the widow said. "He came into town a few days back, asks questions, keeps to himself, pays for things with new coin." She turned back, and there was a steadiness in her voice that was meant to comfort, and did not quite. The sort of man who's looking for something, and hasn't said what. By the time Eliza looked back across the street, the man in the gray coat was gone. The shade beneath the awning stood empty, and somehow that was worse. The walk home felt shorter than the walk in. A full basket will do that. So will hope. Eliza ate when she got back. Not much, just enough to take the worst of the hollow out of her belly and steady the tremor in her hands. Bread she baked rough over the hearth she had finally let herself light. An egg. A spoonful of Della's dark sweet preserves, which tasted of summers she could half remember. The fire crackled in the old stone mouth that had been cold so long. The house felt, for the first time, a degree less dead, and with food in her, and warmth at her back, and the long quiet of the prairie afternoon wrapped around the house. Eliza took out the small square of cloth once more, and spread it flat in the firelight, and went back to the work of reading it. Her mother had taught her stitching. That was the key. She understood that now, the way you understand a thing all at once after circling it for hours. Her mother had not chosen embroidery to hide her message by chance. She had chosen it because it was theirs. A language passed from mother to daughter across 100 quiet evenings, a thing the men who hunted silver would dismiss as women's work beneath their notice, and so would walk right past. Her mother had hidden the map in plain sight, in the one tongue she knew her daughter could read, and her enemies could not. So Eliza stopped trying to read the marks as letters, and she began to read them as her mother would have stitched them. The looping shape that turned back on itself, that was the running stitch border her mother used to mark a boundary, the edge of a thing, a wall, or a fence line. The scatter of knotted points. French knots, her mother had called them, made by winding the thread just so, those marked places. Things that stood up off the ground. A tree, a post, a chimney. The slanted line of stitches. A path. A direction of travel. It was not a picture of a place. It was a set of instructions for crossing one. And slowly, stitch by stitch, in the warm and flickering light, a shape began to come clear beneath the girl's searching fingers. The long border was the edge of the home place, the yard, the cluster of knots near one end. That was the house itself, the chimney, the corners, and the slanted line of the path ran out from the house across the open yard and ended at a single careful knot set apart from the rest, a knot her mother had gone back over, twice, 3 times, reinforcing it, making it bold, making certain her daughter would see it and understand that here was the place that mattered. Eliza followed the path with her fingertip, out of the house, across the yard, to the lone knot at the end, and she lifted her head, slow, and looked toward the window, toward the place in the yard where that knot would fall if she laid the map down over the land itself. Her breath caught. It fell on the well, the old, dry, dead well, the one her uncle had laughed at, the one he had told her, with such pleasure, would yield her nothing but dust. She did not run to it. A wiser part of her, a part that had learned hard lessons in a single hard week, held her still and made her wait. She waited until the sun had set, until the long blue dusk had thickened into proper dark, and the windows of the house gave back nothing but black, until any eyes that might be watching from the road, from the grass, from the shade of an awning miles away, would be blind. Then she took up the lantern, and a coil of stout rope she had found in the barn, and the small, dull knife, and she went out into the yard, to the well her family had been laughed at over. The night was cool and wide and full of small sounds, crickets, the hiss of wind through grass, the far-off cry of some hunting bird. Eliza leaned over the low stone ring and held the lantern down into the throat of the well. The light slid down rough stone walls, down, down, and showed her the bottom, far below, dry, cracked earth, a few fallen stones, a litter of old leaves and dust, exactly as a dead well should look. Nothing. Her heart sank a little. Had she read it wrong? Had hunger and grief and a long, sleepless night fooled her into seeing a map where there was only a dying woman's idle needlework? But then she looked again, harder, the way her mother had taught her to look at a thing that the rest of the world saw one way, and tilt her head, and see it another. And there, perhaps 2/3 of the way down the shaft, where the lantern light caught the stone at an angle, she saw it. The stones were not laid even. On one side of the well, the courses ran straight and true, the way a mason lays them, but on the other side, at that one particular depth, the pattern broke. The stones jutted just slightly, one above another, small ledges, footholds, a way down that was not a fall, and below them, set into the wall where the firelight of no passing day would reach it, a deeper shadow, a darkness within the darkness, an opening where the round throat of the well gave way to something that was not part of the well at all, a chamber, hidden in the side of a dead well, in the very place a proud and grasping man would scorn to lower himself. Eliza's hands trembled on the lantern. This was it. This was the end of her mother's path. This was the thing the careful, reinforced knot had been pointing toward, across the yard, across the dark, across the silence between the living and the dead. She tied the rope off fast to the stone ring and tested it with her weight. She hung the lantern from her wrist by its bail, and she lowered herself over the lip of the well into the cool stone throat, feeling with her feet for the first of those uneven stones. Her boot found it, held, and slowly, breath by breath, foothold by foothold, a 16-year-old girl climbed down into the dark of a well the whole world had given up for dry. The opening was narrow. She had to turn sideways and pull herself through, the rough stone catching at her dress, the lantern bumping against the walls and throwing wild shadows up the shaft above. And then she was through, and she lifted the lantern, and the breath went clean out of her. The chamber was small, a space hollowed into the earth and the rock, no bigger than a modest room, dry and cool and still. The work of patient hands across patient years, shored up with timber, floored with flat stone, a place made with care and with purpose and with love, and it was full. The lantern light leapt and danced and broke into 1,000 small fires as it found what waited there. Chests. Several of them, dark wood bound with iron, their lids thrown back, and spilling from them, heaped and gleaming, coin, gold, and silver, soft and bright in the lantern glow. More than the girl had words for, more than she had imagined the whole wide world might hold. There were small sacks, heavy and slumped, tied at the throat. There were stacked bars, stamped with the marks of distant places, gleaming dull and rich. There were things wrapped in oilcloth that caught the light at their edges and threw it back in colors, green and deep red, and a blue like the heart of a winter sky. It was a fortune past reckoning, hidden beneath a pauper's house, in the side of a dead man's well, under the very noses of the proud and the grasping who had carried off a store and some wagons and a worthless patch of ground, and called themselves rich. Eliza stepped into the chamber, slow, her worn boots whispering on the flat stone floor. The lantern shook in her hand and made the gold seem to breathe. This was her parents' secret. This was why they had lived so plain, why they had borne the town's whispers, the low talk, the looking down. They had been guarding something, a legacy, a future, a thing too precious to spend and too dangerous to show, and they had left it for her, for the daughter who would tilt her head and see the well another way, and climb down into the dark to find the light that waited there. It was as the girl stood, turning slow in that small bright room, that the lantern found one thing more, set apart from the gold, resting on the lid of the nearest chest, where a searching hand would find it first, a book, a plain thing, worn leather, soft at the corners, the kind of journal a man keeps close across long years, and tucked beneath the cord that bound it shut, a folded sheet, sealed with a drop of dark wax and the press of a ring she knew, her father's ring, her father's hand. Eliza set the lantern down on the chest, careful, and she took up the book, and her fingers were not steady as she broke the seal and unfolded the page. The writing was her father's, stronger than her mother's, more angular, leaning forward across the page, the way the man himself had leaned forward into his work, into his life. She read by the gold-touched light, and what she read turned the whole world she thought she knew upside down. Her father wrote that if she was reading this, then she had proven herself everything they had believed her to be: clever, patient, watchful, that she had looked at a ruin and seen a puzzle, looked at a dead well and seen a door, and that the wealth around her was hers now, earned in a way her aunt and uncle could not have earned it if they searched 100 years. And then he explained the rest, and the rest was a trick so deep and so deliberate that it stole the breath from her a second time. The store, the freight wagons, the bright land past the ridge that the whole town whispered over. It was bait, all of it. Her father had known for a long time that his brother circled them like a buzzard circles a thing that has not finished dying. He had known the depth of Silas's greed. He had measured it the way a careful man measures a flood before it comes. And so he had built a trap and baited it with the very greed that drove the man. For seasons, her father wrote, he had been running the businesses quietly into the ground, taking on hidden debts, borrowing heavy and in secret from hard men in far places, men with long memories and short patience. The ledgers Silas would find, the proud, fat ledgers showing rivers of profit, were a careful fiction. Underneath the ink lay nothing but a mountain of what was owed, and the land past the ridge, the prize, the dream, the thing that was supposed to make a man rich. Salted, a handful of richness scattered near the surface, where a greedy eye would find it, and a greedy heart would leap. And beneath it, down where the digging cost a fortune and broke a man's back, nothing. Worthless rock, clear down to the center of the earth. Silas would pour everything he had into it. He would borrow against the dream, hire on men, sink coin after coin into the worthless ground, chasing a ghost that her father had set there, gleaming for him to chase. And the coin he himself had borrowed, her father wrote, he had poured to the last cent into the store, and the ground past the ridge, every bit of it bait, every bit of it owed. The fortune that slept in the well was a different thing altogether. It was theirs, earned honest and saved quiet across all their years, and beholden to no man living. She was to let no one tell her otherwise. And then the hard men in the far places would come to collect what they were owed, and Silas would learn, in one terrible turning of the season, that he had inherited a husk, that the rich man's table he had seated himself at was set over a pit. Eliza lowered the page. She understood now the laughter in the lawyer's office. She had thought they were laughing at her. They had been laughing at the edge of a cliff, with their eyes shut tight, and the long fall already begun. The girl sat down slow on the flat stone floor, the gold glittering soft around her, the journal heavy in her lap. And for a while she simply breathed and let the size of it settle into her. Grief was in it. Grief that her parents had carried so heavy a secret and so long a worry and had told her none of it. To keep her safe, she understood now. To keep her free of the burden until the day she could bear it. And love was in it. Love so deep and so clear-eyed that it had reached past death itself to set a girl's feet on solid ground. And under the grief and the love, something steadier began to rise. A backbone. She opened the worn journal then, to learn what more her father had left her. And on the first page, before the long columns of figures, before the careful notes in his angular hand, she found a few lines written plain. A warning. Her father wrote that wealth has a smell to it, that greed can catch the scent of coin from a long way off, the way a hound catches a fox on the wind. He wrote that the danger was not in the having, but in the showing, that a girl who lived plain and spent careful and let the world go on, believing she had nothing but a ruin and a dry well, would be left in peace. But a girl who let the gold be seen, who painted her house too fine, too fast, who let the town's tongues start to wag about her sudden good fortune, would draw the hounds straight to her door. Move slow, her father had written. Spend quiet. Let them think you have nothing. And trust few. The words sat in the lantern light, and Eliza read them twice and a third time, and felt the truth of them close around her like a cool hand, because she had already seen the hound. She had felt his eyes through a store window not 6 hours past. A man in a gray coat, with quiet hands and new coin, asking questions in a small town, looking for something he had not named. He had been watching her family at the will. He had been watching her in town. And though she did not yet know his name, or his business, or what thread connected him to the trap her father had laid, she understood, with a cold and certain clarity, that the danger her father had warned of was already standing in the road outside. The scent of coin was on the wind, and the hounds were beginning to gather. Eliza climbed back up out of the well in the dead of that night. She took with her a small handful of coin, enough to settle a debt at the store and to live quiet for a while, and no more. The rest she left where her parents had left it, sleeping in the dark, in the side of the well the world had laughed at. She drew the rope up after her, and coiled it, and carried it back to the barn. She washed the dust of the chamber from her hands, and she stood a moment in the cold and starry yard, looking back at the low stone ring of the well, its secret safe again in the dark. Her uncle's words came back to her then, not with sting this time, with something almost like a smile, hard and quiet, at the corner of her mouth. You won't draw a thing out of that hole but dust, girl. She looked at the well, and she thought, we shall see. The night wind moved across the grass. The broken house stood at her back, its hearth still faintly warm, its corners swept clean, its long dead rooms beginning, slow, so slow, to remember what it was to hold a living soul. Eliza turned and went inside. She had food now. She had warmth. She had a fortune sleeping in the earth, and a mother's cleverness stitched into cloth against her heart, and a father's hard wisdom written plain in a worn leather book. And she had a warning. The work ahead would call for every bit of the patience, and the watchfulness, and the backbone her parents had believed she carried. For the gold was found, but finding it, that had been the easy part. Keeping it quiet, keeping it safe, keeping it from the gray-coated hound already circling, and from the uncle whose ruin was riding toward him on the far horizon. That was the trial still to come. And out past the edge of the lantern light, out in the wide and waiting dark, it had already begun. The first frost had not yet come, but the mornings carried a sharpness now, a thin, cold edge that promised it soon would. And a house with holes in its roof is no place to meet the winter. Eliza knew this. She stood in the yard one gray dawn, the journal heavy in the pocket of her apron, and she looked up at the broken house the way a doctor looks at a patient, the sagging porch, the gaping black mouths in the shingles, the shutter that still knocked against the upstairs wall, loose on its single rusted hinge. The house was hers now, truly hers. And a house, like a heart, cannot mend itself by wishing. But here was the trouble, laid plain before her. She could not raise that roof alone. A girl of 16, with 2 hands and a strong will and no more, could sweep a floor and lay a fire and bake rough bread over coals. She could do 100 small things. She could not lift a beam. And so she would have to bring someone in, a stranger, onto the very land where a fortune slept in the side of a dead well. Her father's words rose up in her, written in his hard, angular hand. Spend quiet. Trust few. Few, not none. Eliza turned the word over in her mind, there in the cold dawn, and understood that her father had chosen it with care. He had not written, "Trust no one." A girl who trusts no one builds a fine, strong wall around herself, and starves slow inside it. He had written few, which meant a person must be chosen, carefully, wisely. With the eyes her mother had given her, that could see a thing the way the world saw it, and then tilt, and see it true. So she thought about whom she might trust, and the thinking led her, as so many of her thoughts had begun to lead her of late, back to a counter in a dusty store, and a soft-faced widow who had spoken of her mother with love. The store bell rang above her head. Della looked up, and her face warmed at the sight of the girl, and then went a touch careful when she saw the set of Eliza's jaw. "You've a look about you," the widow said, "like a body with a question she isn't sure she ought to ask." Eliza set the small handful of coin on the counter. Quiet. Just enough to settle what she owed, and a little more besides. Della looked at it. She did not reach for it. "That dead house your kin laughed over," she said slow. "It seems it isn't quite so dead as they reckoned." It was a question, dressed as an observation, a door left open. Eliza had a choice to make, and she made it the way her father would have wished. She gave a little of the truth, and held the rest close. "My mother left me something," the girl said. "Not much, a small thing she'd put by. Enough to keep the rain off my head if I'm careful." She held the widow's gaze. "I need a man who can mend a roof. A man from somewhere else. A man who minds his own affairs, and asks no questions about a girl's business, and forgets the road to my door the day the work is done." Della was quiet a moment. She understood more than was said. Eliza could see that. The widow had buried a husband and run a store alone in a hard country, and she had learned to hear the music underneath the words. But she did not pry. "There's a man," Della said at last. "Old Tate, a builder, lives a good ways off, past where the wagons turn. He worked these parts years back, before your time, and he was honest as a plumb line and twice as quiet." A small nod. "He's no friend to your uncle, no friend to anybody, much. Keeps to his tools and his own thoughts." She paused. "If you want a man who'll fix your roof and forget your face, you'll not do better than Tate." Eliza let out a breath she had been holding. "Thank you," she said, and the widow reached out then and folded her broad, warm hand over the girl's thin, cold one, just for a moment, on the worn wood of the counter. "You don't have to carry it all yourself, child," Della said, low. "Whatever it is you're carrying, that's a thing the strong ones forget. They think the carrying alone is what makes them strong." She squeezed, gentle. "It isn't. The strong ones are the ones who know which hands to put a little of it into." Eliza did not answer. She could not, just then, But she carried those words home with her, all the long road back, and she found they warmed her near as much as the bread had, that first cold day. Old Tate came 3 days later, in a wagon piled with timber and tools. He was a lean and weathered man, gray-bearded, with hands like the roots of an old tree, and eyes that had grown used to measuring things. He climbed down, and he looked the house over from foundation to ridgepole, slow, the way a man reads a thing he respects. He did not ask how a ruined girl in a ruined house had coin to pay him. He did not ask what she meant to do, all alone, in such a place. He looked at the work, and he named a price that was fair, and when Eliza counted it out, he counted it back to be sure, and nodded once and said, "Then we'd best begin before the cold does." That was the whole of their bargain, and the mending began. There is a particular music to a house coming back to life. The ring of a hammer, the rasp of a saw, the thud of good new timber set into place by hands that know their craft. Across those days, the broken house filled with that music, and Eliza found she loved it more than any tune she had heard. The roof closed over, hole by hole, until the long pale ribbons of light that had fallen through the gaps were gone, and the rooms grew dim and warm and whole. The shutter stopped its knocking. Tate took it down, mended the hinge, hung it true, and the silence where that lonely sound had been was its own kind of healing. New glass went into the windows. The sagging porch was jacked up and braced and made level, so a body could stand on it without feeling the lean of it underfoot. And as the house mended, something in the girl mended alongside it. She did not weep for her parents anymore in the cold of the night. The grief was in her still. It would be in her a long while, but it had changed its shape. It had gone from a wound that bled to a scar that held. A thing she could carry, and even, on the good days, be glad of, because it was made of love. She baked in the warm kitchen. She mended the fence. She set a few late seeds in the turned earth of the dead garden, just to see if anything green would answer. And in the evenings, when Tate had gone to his bedroll in the barn, she would sit in her father's worn chair. She let herself sit in it now, and read his journal by lamplight, and study the long columns of figures, and learn the shape of the trap her parents had laid. It was, she came to understand, a thing of terrible patience. Her father had spent seasons building it. Every debt taken on in secret, every false ledger drawn up fine, every shovelful of salted richness scattered on the worthless ground past the ridge, set there to catch a greedy eye and a greedy heart. And it was working. She heard it in the talk that drifted out from town, carried by Della and by the few souls who passed her road. Silas was spending like a man who has found the bottom of the world to be made of coin, hiring on crews, buying wagons, sinking everything he had, and a great deal he did not have, into the worthless ground past the ridge, chasing the ghost her father had set gleaming there for him. He had the status he had craved, the fine coat, the loud voice in the public house, the men tipping their hats, and he had no notion at all that the ground beneath him had been hollowed out long ago and was waiting, patient as the grave, to give way. But the mending of a house, it turned out, does not stay a secret in a small country. A hammer rings far across open land, and tongues wag. Word reached town, the way word does. The dead house at the edge of the world was rising from its grave. The orphaned girl, the one they had laughed over, had a builder out there. New glass in her windows. A straight new porch. Where, folk wondered aloud over their counters and their fences, had a penniless girl found the coin for all that? And word reached town, reached the public house, reached a fine coat and a loud voice, reached Silas. He came on a cold, bright afternoon, without warning, the way a man comes when he means to catch something he is not supposed to see. Eliza heard the wagon before she saw it. She was in the yard, scattering grain for a few hens she had begun to keep. She straightened and shaded her eyes, and watched the familiar shape come rattling up the long track. And a cold knot formed in her belly, the same cold knot from the lawyer's office, weeks and a lifetime ago. Tate, up on the roof, paused his hammer. He looked down at the girl, a question in it. Eliza gave him the smallest shake of her head. Go on. Say nothing. The old man held her eye a moment. Then he bent back to his work, slow and easy, a man with nothing to hide and nothing to say. Silas climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard and turned in a slow circle and looked. He looked at the mended roof, the straight porch, the new glass throwing back the afternoon sun. He looked the way a man looks at a sum that has come out wrong, with a deepening, narrowing suspicion. Well, he said, the smiling mouth, the cold eyes. Aren't you the busy little thing? Hello, Uncle, said Eliza, even, plain. I heard tell you'd come into something. He strolled toward her, slow, his eyes moving over the house, the yard, the barn. Word is, the dead house has risen up. Word is, my poor orphaned niece has found herself a fortune to fix it with. He stopped. Now where, I wonder, would a girl with nothing find a thing like that? Eliza did not look toward the well. It took everything in her, but she did not let her eyes so much as flicker toward the low stone ring across the yard. My mother left a little put by, she said, the same small truth. Enough to keep the rain off. You'll recall you didn't think it worth much, the house. I'm only making it fit to live in. A little put by. Silas said it slow, tasting it, not believing it. And you spent it on glass and shingles. He took another step. His gaze had begun to rove now, hungry, prying. Funny. I went through this place top to bottom, the day the will was read. Turned out every drawer, every box. His eyes lifted to the upstairs window where the broken strongbox had sat, and slid down, and began, slow, to cross the yard. Found nothing. Nothing at all. His voice dropped. Makes a man wonder what he might have missed. And his gaze began to settle on the well. The knot in Eliza's belly pulled tight. She had perhaps a breath. 2. And in that breath, she heard her mother's voice, the way she had heard it her whole life. Tilt your head. See it another way. So she did not fight the look. She helped it. Oh, that old well, she said, and she let a weariness into her voice, a girl's tired complaint. You'd not believe the trouble it's been. Tate says the whole side of it's gone soft. The stones are dropping into the throat of it like loose teeth. She walked toward it as she spoke, easy, unafraid, the way a person walks toward a thing that holds no secret. He says I've to fill it in before someone falls and breaks their neck. A body leans on that ring wrong, and the whole works could come down. She reached the well, and she set her hand on the stone ring, and she pushed. and a loose stone she had set there herself that very morning, for just such a need, grated and shifted and tumbled inward, clattering down the shaft into the dark. The sound echoed up, long and hollow and dangerous. Silas, 3 steps off, stopped where he stood. "See," said Eliza, and stepped back from it, brushing her hands. "Soft as rotten bread. I'll be glad to be shut of it. Tate'll fill it in before the frost." She turned and looked at her uncle, plain and open. "Did you want to see down it? Mind the ring, then. I'd hate for you to take a fall on my account." She held the lie out to him on an open hand. And greed, as her father had written, is a kind of blindness. Silas looked at the low stone ring, at the loose and grating stones, at the long, dark, dangerous throat that had just swallowed a rock into echoing nothing, a dead well, soft-sided, a thing about to be filled with dirt. His mind, full of a fortune in silver and fine coats and loud rooms, found nothing in such a place worth the risk of a broken neck. A man hunting a king's ransom does not climb down a crumbling hole after pennies. He had walked past the gold once already, in his greed, and now, at the very lip of it, his greed walked him past it again. "Bah," Silas said, and turned away. "Fill the cursed thing in, then. I've better things to do than gawp down a hole." He climbed back toward his wagon, his suspicion not gone, but turned aside, pointed back toward the bright, worthless ground past the ridge where he believed his true fortune waited. "You enjoy your splinters and your shingles, girl. Make the most of your little put-by." He gathered the reins. "It's more than you'll have again," he said, and he laughed, and he drove away. Eliza stood by the well until the wagon was a speck, and then nothing, and the dust had settled on the cold, bright air. Then her knees went, just a little, and she put her hand on the stone ring to steady herself, and she let out a long, shaking breath. Up on the roof, old Tate had watched the whole of it. He said nothing, but when the girl looked up at him, the old man touched the brim of his hat to her, slow and grave, the way a man salutes a thing well done. The danger from the uncle had been turned aside, but a sharper danger had grown closer all the while. It came 3 nights later, in the dark, without a wagon, without a sound, the way the worst things come. Eliza had stepped out to the porch to bring in the lantern she had hung against the cold, and a voice spoke from the shadow at the end of it, low and dry and patient. "Evening." She went still. A shape unfolded from the dark, where it had been sitting on the new straight porch, as if it owned it. Gray coat, quiet hands, a hat tipped low. The man from the lawyer's office, the man from the store window, the hound her father had warned of, come at last to her door. "Forgive the hour," he said, and rose, slow, and the lantern light found the lower half of a long weathered face and a thin, patient mouth. "I find a body speaks plainer in the dark, fewer eyes, fewer ears." He did not move toward her. He did not have to. The stillness of him was its own threat. "My name's of no account, but the men I work for, their names you'd know, if your father had kept honest books, which," a thin smile, "he did not." Eliza's hand tightened on the lantern. She said nothing. She had learned the worth of saying nothing. "They're owed," the man went on, easy, conversational, as if they were 2 neighbors passing the time. "A great deal, By the man who took your father's affairs. And that man's been spending what he doesn't have, chasing silver and worthless dirt, and the well of his credit is running dry. The thin smile again. Dry as that hole in your yard, I'd wager. The word hole sat in the cold air. Eliza did not let her face change. So I came out to this country, the man said, to find what's owed. And I'll tell you plain, girl, what I found puzzles me. I found a ruined house your kin laughed over, rising up fine and new. I found a penniless orphan, paying a builder good coin. He took one slow step, and I asked myself, where does the money truly lie? With the loud man digging a worthless hole past the ridge, or with the quiet girl fixing up a dead house at the edge of the world, over a well her uncle was fool enough to laugh at? The cold knot in Eliza's belly turned to ice. He suspected. He did not know, but he suspected, and a man like this, patient and dry and pitiless, would dig at a suspicion the way Silas dug at the worthless ground until he struck something, or struck bottom. You're mistaken, she said, quiet, steady. My mother left a little put-by. The whole town knows it. I've spent it on a roof. There's nothing here but a girl and a house and a hole full of falling stones. The man studied her a long moment in the lantern light. Maybe, he said. Maybe so. He settled his hat. But here's a thing I know, girl, that you'd do well to learn. A house that was dead and is now alive. Got that way somehow. And somehow leaves a trail. He turned to go, then paused, and the patience in his voice grew teeth. Your builder, for one. Old men talk, in public houses, of the fine work they've done, of grand old places brought back to life by their own clever hands. He looked back at her. A man hears things, if he's patient, and I am a very patient man. And he walked off into the dark, unhurried, and was gone. And he left behind him a poison, because Eliza stood there in the cold, her heart slamming, and the man's words turned over and over in her mind. Your builder, for one. Old men talk in public houses. Tate had talked. Tate had sat in some warm public room and bragged of his clever work on a fine old place, and the hound had heard it, and followed the scent straight to her door. She had trusted. Against her father's warning, she had led a man onto her land, near her secret, and he had talked. And now the wolf was at the door because of it. The old wound tore open inside her. The wound from the lawyer's office. The wound that whispered in the cold and lonely dark. There is no one. There is no one you can trust. They take, and they laugh, and the ones you let close are the ones who lead the wolves to you. She did not sleep that night, and in the morning, when old Tate came in from the barn with the cold on him, she met him in the yard with a face gone hard as the frost. You talked, she said, flat, cold. In town, of your work here, of this house. Her voice shook, for all she tried to hold it. A man came in the night. A dangerous man. He knew of you. He followed your bragging here like a hound follows blood. Old Tate stopped where he stood, and the hurt that crossed his weathered face was so plain and so deep that it gave her pause even in her anger. "Aye," the old man said at last, slow, heavy. "I'll not lie to you, for I haven't the trick of it." He took off his hat and turned it in his root-knuckled hands. "I was in the public house a week back. A man there, a fine talker, bought around, got to asking about my trade, and I was proud, girl. I'll own it. I told him I was bringing a grand old place back from the dead. Finest work I'd done in years. He looked up, and his old eyes were wet at the corners. I said no word of you, no word of coin, nor wells, nor what you might have. I'd not do that. But I spoke of the house, and I see now. That was a word too many. He turned the hat, turned it. I'm an old fool who loves his craft too well to keep his mouth shut about it, he said. And if my foolishness brought a wolf to your door, then I've done you a wrong I can't undo, and I'll go from here today and trouble your door no more. And he turned to gather his tools, and Eliza stood there, and the wound in her ached and whispered its old cold whisper. See, there is no one. Send him off. Trust none of them. But she looked at the old man, truly looked, the way her mother had taught her. Tilt your head. See it true. And what she saw was not a betrayer. What she saw was an old man who loved good work, who had spoken a proud word in a warm room, who had named no secret and meant no harm, and whose face, this cold morning, was wet with the shame of a wrong he had not known he was doing. A foolishness, not a betrayal. There is a difference, and the seeing of that difference is one of the hardest and finest things a wounded heart can learn. Stop, she said. Tate paused, his tools half gathered. You spoke no secret, Eliza said, and her voice had lost its hard, cold edge. You named no coin, no well, no fortune. You spoke of a house, and your pride in mending it, and a man with a wolf's heart made of it what he wished. She drew a breath. That's no betrayal, Tate. That's an old man loving his craft, and I'll not send a good man off into the cold for the crime of being proud of honest work. The old builder looked at her, and something passed between them, there in the frost-bright yard. Something that the lawyer's office had taken from her, and that she had thought gone for good. A thread of trust, restitched, stronger, maybe, for having been torn and mended. The way her mother's old quilt was strongest in the corner that had been mended past counting. Finish the work, Eliza said, and help me think, because that man will come again, and I've a notion he'll need turning aside, the same as my uncle, and 2 heads, I find, are better than one. A small, hard smile, that was her mother's smile, and her father's both. Even when one of them talks too much in public houses. Old Tate let out a breath that was half a laugh and half a sob, and set his tools back down, and put his hat back on. Aye, he said, rough. That they are. The hound would come again. Eliza was sure of it, so she did not wait for him. She had a father's journal full of the truth, the false ledgers, the secret debts, the worthless salted ground past the ridge. She had a mind her parents had trusted, and she had begun, at last, to think not as a hunted girl, but as a hunter. Her father had built a trap for a greedy man. Why, she thought, could a daughter not do the same? The hound believed the money lay with her. Very well. Let him be shown, plain as day, that he was wrong, that the man who owed his masters was Silas, and that everything Silas had was sunk in worthless dirt, and that the way to collect was not to dig at a quiet girl, but to fall, with all his pitiless patience, upon a loud and ruined man. She did not have to lie to do it. That was the beauty of it. And she felt her father smiling somewhere in the cold air as she saw it. The truth was, trap enough. The land past the ridge was truly worthless. Silas's debts were truly vast. All the hound needed was to be turned gently from the false scent to the true one, to be shown the worthless ground with his own patient eyes, and led to understand that the husk he sought to crack was not a girl and a well, but a fine coat and a loud voice, digging his own grave in salted dirt past the ridge. Greed had walked Silas past a fortune twice. Now greed would be made to devour itself. Eliza sat that night in her father's chair, by the warm hearth, in the house that had risen from the dead. The journal lay open in her lap. Old Tate's hammer was quiet in the barn. Somewhere out in the dark, a patient man in a gray coat was waiting, certain his quarry was the quiet girl. He had it backward, and she meant to show him. She looked into the fire, and she thought of her mother stitching a map by candlelight, smiling in her last quiet days. She thought of her father, building a slow and terrible justice out of his brother's own bottomless greed. They had handed her more than gold. They had handed her a way of seeing, and the wolf at her door, she understood now, was not the end of her. He was the next thread in a pattern she had finally learned to read. She closed the journal, and in the firelight, the girl who had been laughed at, abandoned, and left for nothing, began very quietly to plan. A patient man is a dangerous thing, but patience, Eliza had come to understand, can be turned. A hound follows the strongest scent on the wind, and the wind can be made to shift if a body is clever enough, and cold enough, and willing to wait. She did not set out to lie to him. That was the heart of her father's wisdom, and she held to it the way a sailor holds to a rope in a high sea. A lie can be caught out. A lie has loose threads, and a patient man pulls threads for a living. Pull one, and the whole garment comes apart in his hands. But the truth needed no defending. The truth was that the man who owed the hard men in the far places was Silas. The truth was that everything Silas had was sunk into worthless ground past the ridge. The truth was that the husk worth cracking stood not at the edge of the world, in a mended house, behind the eyes of a quiet girl, but in town, in a fine coat, growing louder and thinner and more desperate with each passing week. All the hound lacked was the eyes to see it. So Eliza gave him eyes. It was a small thing in the end, and a quiet one. She let it be known through a careful word to Della, who let it drift where such words drift, from counter to counter, from porch to porch, that the orphaned girl had spent the last of her small inheritance, that she was scraping by on hen's eggs and garden greens and the kindness of a widow, that there was nothing left at the dead house but a girl, and a roof, and a hole in the ground full of falling stones. And she let it be known, too, in the same careful way, that the silver past the ridge had begun to fail, that the loud man's crews were grumbling for wages he was slow to pay, that the ground gave up a little near the top, and nothing at all below, that a man who had seemed so rich, so sudden, might have built his fine house upon sand. She set the true scent on the wind, and then she waited the way her parents had taught her to wait. She did not have to wait long. The patient man in the gray coat came to her door one last time, in the gray light of a cold morning when the frost still lay blue in the hollows of the yard. He stood on the new straight porch and looked at her a long while, and Eliza looked back, plain, tired, poor. A girl with garden dirt under her nails and a careful patch sewn into the sleeve of her dress. She had dressed for this the way Cora had once dressed for grief. She had dressed to be believed. "I've been watching," he said at last, "a good while now." "I know it," she said. "You live thin. I live as I'm able." He turned his patient eyes out across the yard, to the low stone ring of the well, soft-sided and dangerous and waiting to be filled with dirt. And Eliza let him look. She did not flinch. She did not let her gaze so much as drift toward it. She had filled the throat of it the night before with a careful litter of fallen stone, arranged just so that a lantern lowered down, it would show a body a ruined, half-collapsed hole and nothing more. A dead thing, a danger, a chore waiting to be done. She had learned, across a hard season, to give a searching man exactly what he expected to find. The hound looked, and the hound, at last, believed. "I had a notion the money was here," he said. Slow. He almost sounded sorry to give it up. "I'll own I was taken with the notion. A quiet girl, a mended house, a dead well her uncle was fool enough to laugh at. It had a shape to it, a neatness." He settled his hat lower. "But a girl who lives on eggs and greens in a house held up with the last of her dead mother's pennies. That girl owes my masters nothing, and has nothing worth the taking." He almost smiled. "Whereas a loud man passed the ridge, digging a fortune into worthless dirt on borrowed coin. That man owes a great deal." A pause. "And the time has come to collect it." He touched the brim of his hat to her. "Grave, the way old Tate had that day on the roof." "You've a hard eye, girl, for one so young," he said. "You look at a thing the world's done with, and you find what's still left inside it. I've met few enough who can do that." He turned to his horse. "Mind you keep the knack of it. It'll carry you farther than any fortune." And he mounted, and he rode off toward the ridge, toward the loud man, toward the husk worth cracking. Eliza stood on the porch until the gray coat was a speck against the pale sky, and then nothing at all. And then she let out the breath she felt she had been holding for the better part of a season. Her knees went loose. She set a hand on the porch rail, the straight new rail that did not lean, and she steadied herself against it. She did not feel triumph. She had thought she would. In the long nights of planning, bent over her father's journal by the fire, she had imagined this moment would taste of victory. It did not. It tasted of something quieter and stranger and far heavier than victory. It tasted like the closing of a trap. What followed, the girl did not see with her own eyes. She had no wish to. But word came to her, the way word comes, carried on the cold wind, and across Stella's counter, and in the talk of the few souls who passed her road. And she pieced it together in the warm evenings, by lamplight, and it had the shape of a thing falling a long, long way down. The hard men came, not in person, at the first. They came in letters and in agents, and in the patient, gray-coated man who knew the worth of waiting. They came to call in what they were owed. And they found a man who had nothing to pay them with but worthless ground, and borrowed wagons, and a fine coat going thin at the elbows. The crews went first. A man cannot keep crews he cannot pay, and word of unpaid wages runs faster than fire through dry grass. The men downed their tools and drifted off to find honest work elsewhere, and the worthless ground past the ridge fell silent. The picks went still. The dream went quiet. Then the wagons went, hauled away by hard-faced men with papers in their hands. The fine freight wagons that were to have carried a fortune up and down the long roads, carried off instead in a slow and sorry line, like a funeral with no body in it. Then the store, the good name above the door, painted over. Then the fine things, one by one, the horses, the furniture, the brooch from Cora's throat, sold or seized or simply gone. And at the last, the loud voice in the public house went quiet too. For a ruined man finds the room grows cold around him. The hats stop tipping. The rounds stop being bought. The men who had hung on his every word when his pockets were full and his luck seemed to shine, found somewhere else to look when the shine wore off. And Silas, who had built his whole self out of the noise other men made over him, found himself at the end in a fine cold house that grew emptier by the week, with nothing but the silence, and his wife, and the ruin he had dug with his own two greedy hands. He clutched at the gleam a while longer. A drowning man clutches at what shines. He sank the last of everything into chasing the silver that had never truly been there, certain that the next foot of dirt would prove the doubters wrong, would make him whole, would hand him back the loud, bright world he had thought was his. It proved them right instead. Below the scattered richness her father had set there, gleaming, to catch a greedy eye and a greedy heart, lay nothing at all but cold, worthless rock, clear down past the reach of any hope. And in that fine cold house, a man and his wife sat among the wreckage of a dream that had been built, brick by patient brick, by a dead man's clever hands, to fail. And they quarreled, for greed, when its feast is taken from it, turns and feeds on whatever is nearest. And what was nearest to Silas was Cora, and what was nearest to Cora was Silas. And the love, if it had been love, and not merely two grasping hands clasped over the same shining thing, began to come apart at the seams, the way a cheap garment comes apart when the weather turns hard. Eliza heard of it, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she took no joy in the hearing. She had wanted justice. Her parents had built her a justice, precise and terrible and fair, and aimed with a patience that took her breath. She had needed it. She had earned it. She would not pretend otherwise. But she found, sitting in the warm house her own hands had helped to mend, with the firelight soft on the walls and Della humming in the next room, that justice tastes of ashes when a body sits and watches it land. And she understood in those quiet evenings that her father had known that too, for he had written at the very end of his journal, in a hand that had grown gentler toward the last, words the girl returned to often now. Do not feast on their fall. He had written, let it be enough that the scales are made level. A heart that feasts on another's ruin learns the taste of ruin and comes, in time, to hunger for it. Be done with them and build. So she built, and the seasons turned, the way the seasons do, soft and slow and certain. And then the day came, a cold, bright day, with the first true frost silvering the long grass, when a wagon she did not know came rattling up the track to her door. It was a poor wagon, worn at the wheels, patched at the seat, the kind of wagon a body hires when there is nothing left to call their own. And on the seat of it sat Silas and Cora. Eliza was on the porch when they came. She did not go down to meet them. She stood, with her hand resting on the straight new rail, and she watched them climb down, stiff and awkward and slow. And her heart did a strange and complicated thing inside her chest, for they were diminished. Silas's fine coat hung rumpled and stained upon him, going thin, going gray. His face was pale and unshaven, and the arrogant light had gone clean out of his eyes and left them hollow and hungry and afraid. He had grown smaller somehow, as if the loud man had been mostly air all along, and the air had gone out of him at last. And Cora's fine dress hung wrong on her thin frame now, garish and out of place against the worn boards of the hired wagon. Her face was a pinched and weary mask. The brooch was gone from her throat. Her hands, when she clasped them, trembled. They came to the foot of the porch steps, and they stopped there. The proud pair who had laughed in a lawyer's office, humbled now, standing in the cold shadow of the dead house they had mocked, that stood whole and warm and living above them. "Eliza," Silas began. His voice was a rasp, a dry husk of the voice that had filled so many rooms. He could not quite bring himself to meet her eye. We've had some misfortune. A setback," Cora said quickly, wringing her thin hands, "in our ventures. The silver, it was not what we were promised. It was not what we were led to believe. We are—" The word caught in her throat and would not come. "We are ruined, child," Silas said. And there it was, the whole of it, laid out plain at the foot of the steps in the cold morning light. Eliza did not speak for a long moment. She let the silence stretch. She had learned the worth of a silence across this hard season, how it can be made to work, how it can do the saying that words cannot. She let them stand in it. She let them feel the warmth coming off the house at her back, the house they had called a pile of splinters and dust, and she let them measure that warmth against the cold of their own ruin. "I see," she said at last, even, calm, almost gentle. "We hoped," Silas pushed on, the words dragging out of him like stones, "that for the sake of family, you might see your way to helping us. Alone, perhaps, some small thing, to get us back upon our feet." Alone. Eliza looked at him, at the smiling mouth that did not smile now, at the cold, proud eyes gone soft and wet and desperate with want, and she let a small, thoughtful expression cross her face. "Alone," she said, turning the word over slow. "But uncle, what could a girl like me possibly have to loan you?" She let her gaze drift, easy, unhurried across the wide cold yard. "All I have is this derelict house and that old dry well." She paused, and she brought her eyes back to his and held them. "You told me the day you left me out here," she said, soft as the frost, "that I'd draw nothing out of that well but dust." A beat. "Seems to me a body can pull a great deal out of dust, if she's the kind to look close, and the other fellow's the kind to look away." The color drained from Silas's face. He stared at her. His mouth opened and closed and opened again, and no sound came out of it. And she watched the understanding move through him, slow and cold and terrible, as his own cruel words came home at last to roost. He could not have said how. He could not have proved a single thing of it. But somewhere down in the ruin of him, in the place where a man keeps the truths he tries hardest not to know, he understood that this had been no accident, that the wheel that had ground him down had been set turning a long, long time ago, and that the girl he had laughed at and pitied and thrown away like a thing of no account had not been the fool in the room. "You," he breathed. "I wish you no further harm, Uncle," Eliza said, and the strangest thing of all was that she meant it. "But I'll loan you nothing. The road you're on, you chose with your own 2 feet, long before you ever climbed onto a wagon to drive me out here. I'll not set you back upon it. That would be no kindness." She held his eye, steady and clear. "That would be more dust." Silas stood frozen a long, long moment, the full weight of his humiliation settling over his bowed shoulders like a fall of cold snow. Then he turned, without another word, a broken man, his shoulders curved inward, and he shuffled back toward the hired wagon. There was nothing left for him to say, and some last small part of him seemed, at the end, to know it. But Cora did not follow him at once. Cora lingered, and this was the thing Eliza had not foreseen, the thing no plan of hers had laid out, no page of her father's journal had warned of. The aunt came forward, the few small steps to the foot of the porch, her thin hands twisting in the worn fringe of her shawl, and up close, in the hard, bright light, the mask of her face had cracked clean through, and underneath it was something Eliza had long taken to be absent altogether. Shame, and under the shame, older and deeper, something almost gentle, a buried thing, a forgotten thing. "I've nothing to ask you for," Cora said, low, pitched, so the broken man at the wagon would not hear. "I know what we did. I'll not insult you by pretending I don't." Her chin trembled. "But there's a thing I've been carrying a long while now, and it was never rightly mine to keep." And she drew her hand out from beneath the shawl, and in her thin, trembling palm lay a small thing, a locket, worn and plain, the gold of it gone soft with years of handling, the kind of small treasure a woman keeps close against her heart across the whole of a lifetime. And Eliza knew it, at once, the way a body knows her own name, for she had seen it 1,000 times and more at her mother's throat, catching the light of 1,000 ordinary evenings. Her mother's locket. "The day the will was read," Cora said, and her voice shook now, and the words came hard. "Silas had me search the upstairs, the box, the drawers, everything, and I found this, tucked into a corner where he'd not have thought to look." She swallowed. "He'd have melted it down for the few pennies of gold in it. He looked at everything that way, your uncle, by its weight in coin. So I hid it from him. I told myself I'd sell it, come a hard enough time." A tear stood trembling in the corner of her eye, and broke, and ran down the lines of her weary face. "But I couldn't," she whispered. "I tried, child. In the worst of it, with us starving, I took it out to sell, more than once, and my hand would not let it go. I don't know why. I was not a soft woman." She held the locket out across the cold air between them. "It was your mother's. It should have come to you, with all the rest of what we stole. I'm sorry. For this. For all of it. For more than I've got the words to say. Eliza looked at the locket, and then she looked at the woman holding it. This hard, vain, grasping woman who had dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief while a girl's whole world was carved up across a lawyer's desk, who had laughed at a grieving child and helped to cast her out to a ruin at the edge of the world, and who had also, in the dark and shameful pit of her own ruin, with nothing to gain by it and her own belly empty, kept one small thing safe. Out of a scrap of decency she had not known she still carried, a scrap she could not name, and could not sell, and could not, in the end, let go. People are not made of one cloth. Eliza understood that now, in a way she had not before. A heart can hold greed in one chamber and grief in the next. A hand that takes can also, in some forgotten corner of itself, keep. She came down the porch steps, and she took the locket from her aunt's thin, trembling hand. Gently, her own fingers closed around it, and it was warm. Warm from Cora's keeping. Warm from being held all that hard while against another woman's frightened heart. "Thank you," Eliza said, and she meant that too. For a moment the two of them stood there in the cold, bright yard, and something passed between them that was not forgiveness, quite. For forgiveness of a wrong so deep is a long, long road, and may take a whole life to walk to its end. But it was the first faint footfall upon that road, a single step, taken in the frost. "Wait here," Eliza said. She went into the house, and she came back out with a small purse, not large, not a fortune, a careful, modest sum. And she pressed it into her aunt's hands, and folded the thin, cold fingers closed over it. "This is not for him," she said quietly, with the smallest glance toward the broken man slumped on the wagon seat, staring at nothing. "He chose his road, and walked it of his own will, and I'll not carry him back along it. But you," she met her aunt's startled eyes, "you kept my mother's locket safe when you'd nothing to gain by it and everything to lose. And a heart that can do that, in its darkest hour, is a heart with something left in it worth the saving." Cora stared at her, the tears coming in earnest now. And they were not the dry-eyed theater of a lawyer's office. They were real and raw, and they washed something old and hard right out of her. "Why?" the woman whispered. "After what we did to you. Why?" "Because my mother saw the world one way," Eliza said, and then she'd tilt her head and see it true. "And the truth is that nobody is worth nothing." She closed her aunt's hands tighter around the purse. "Not a derelict house, not a dry well, not a thrown-away girl, and not a hard woman in a hard season who kept one small kindness alive when everything else in her had gone cold." A small, certain smile touched her lips, and it was her mother's smile, and her father's both. "There's worth in the most of us, if a body just troubles herself to look close enough to find it. That's the real inheritance my parents left me. Not the gold." She paused. The eyes to see it, and Cora bowed her head over her folded, full hands and wept, and could not find a single word to answer. There was honest work, Eliza told her. 2 towns over. Plain work. Sewing and keeping a house in good order. Poor and decent, and her own. Della knew of the place, and could speak for her. A life that was not built upon what a body could take from others. And the road to it, Eliza said, did not run through Silas. Then Cora turned and climbed up beside her ruined husband, and the poor hired wagon rattled away down the long track into the wide cold morning and was gone from sight. Silas did not come to her door again. The story of him drifted back across the seasons, the way such stories do, that he sold what scraps remained to him and went away to outrun his debts and his shame, and became, in time, a tale folk shook their heads over of an evening. Pride, they'd say. Pride and a greed that had no bottom to it. The both of them going before a long, hard fall. But Cora took the work. It was poor, and it was plain, and it was honest, and word came drifting back, season upon season, that the hard, vain woman had grown somehow softer in the doing of it, that she sewed a fine, careful seam, that she kept a clean and orderly house, and was gentle with the children of the family she served, and had been heard to laugh, truly laugh, not the brittle thing she'd laughed in the lawyer's office, at some small joke over the wash. It was not a grand redemption. Life gives few of those. But it was a thread, re-stitched, and Eliza, who knew better than most the worth of a thread mended back into the cloth, was quietly glad of it. And the woman who had once been a thrown-away girl built her life. She built it slow. She built it quiet. She built it the way her father had written she should, drawing from the well a careful sum at a time, asking no notice, painting nothing too fine too fast, drawing no hounds to her door. She bought land, good land, with sweet water running through it, the kind a body can raise a future upon. She started a small herd, and tended it through the hard seasons and the soft, and watched it grow strong, and she kept the home place at the heart of it all, the mended house, the warm hearth, and the old well whose secret stayed hers, for it was her fortress, and her sanctuary, and the place where she had learned, in the cold and the dark, exactly who she was. Old Tate stayed on. He had no kin to speak of, and the girl had become a kind of kin to him, and he pottered about the place, mending what wanted mending, and grumbling at the weather, and loving his good work, and talking a deal too much about it. And he was, in his rough and weathered way, a grandfather to her. And Della closed up the dusty store at the last, when her knees grew weary of the standing, and she came out to the home place to live. And the widow who had once spoken of a dead woman with love became to the orphaned girl very nearly a mother. They would sit together of the long evenings, the two of them, on the straight new porch that did not lean, watching the sun go down soft and gold over the herd and the water and the good land rolling toward the far ridge. And they would not need to fill the quiet with talking. The girl who had been so certain she had no one in all the world found that she had a family, after all. Not the family she was born to. That family slept now in the cold ground in town, and she tended their resting places, and loved them still, and missed them with an ache that softened, season upon season, but did not leave her, and that she would not have given up if she could. But a family, all the same, made, not given, chosen the way her father had taught her to choose, a few good hands to put a little of the carrying into, for the strong ones, as Della had told her once across a dusty counter, are not the ones who carry it all alone. They are the ones who know which hands to trust with a share of the weight. And the woman did one thing more. With the fortune that slept in the side of the dead, well, she gave. Quietly, with her name on none of it. She saw to it that the town had a proper schoolhouse, where the children could learn their letters in a warm, dry room with a good stove against the cold. She made certain the country doctor had what he needed to tend the sick, whether they had coin to pay him or whether they had none. And when a hard season came and a struggling family stood to lose their place, a quiet sum would find its way to their door. And no soul knew quite where it had come from, and Eliza liked it that way, for she had learned at last what wealth was truly for. It was not for the loud room and the fine coat and the tipping of hats. Silas had taught her that, by showing her, with his whole ruined life, its very opposite. It was for building, for mending, for looking close at the things and the people the world had given up on. A dead house, a dry well, a thrown-away girl, a hard, ruined woman with one small kindness left alive in her, and seeing the worth that lay hidden inside them, and helping that worth rise up into the light. That was the secret her parents had stitched into a worn old quilt and buried in the side of a dead well. Not the gold. The gold had been the smallest part of it, all along. On a quiet evening, late in the gentle turning of a year, the woman who had once been that thrown-away girl sat upon her porch, with her mother's locket warm against her own throat, and Della in the chair beside her, and the good land spreading soft and gold toward the distant ridge. And she thought of the day a man had laughed and told her she would draw nothing from that well but dust. She had drawn a whole life out of it. They had scorned the worn old quilt and the dead dry well. They had no notion that a dying mother had stitched a future into the one, and hidden it away in the side of the other, and set it by, with a quiet and patient love, for the daughter who would trouble herself to look close. They had been so certain they were taking everything, and in the warm gold of that evening, the woman who had once been laughed at reached over and took the worn old hand of the woman who had become her family and held it gentle, as the dark came soft across the land, a dead house, a dry well, a joke read aloud in a cold little room, and out of all of it, somehow, a home.